It's great to be with you all. Like Ryan said, I just got back from Togo, West Africa, last week. I went there to work with a new hospital that just opened up. I was working with Samaritan's Purse over there for 3 months, living there. When I first flew in, the airport is in a city called Lome, which is right on the coast. The hospital is in a little village called Mongo that's 9 hours north. I had to wait for a driver to come and pick me up and take me to Mongo, so I spent 2 days at a guest house in Lome. The staff spoke no English, and I only speak a little bit of French that I picked up in high school. So we were relying on my knowledge of French to communicate. In the first hour, I managed to make a total idiot out of myself. Instead of telling them that their Wi-Fi wasn't working, I told them that their internet was unemployed. And then I had read about food prep, like how to eat so that you don't get sick in another country. And the recommendations are things like don't drink tap water, just drink bottled or filtered water. Don't eat food from street vendors. And then there was this thing about bread. And it said, if you get bread from the market, you actually are supposed to bring it home and bake it again. You have to heat it up to kill all the germs that might be on it from people touching it at the market. So the cook at the guest house asked me if I wanted bread with my dinner. And I said, yes, but... And then I tried to explain to him that bread thing that I just told you in English, but tell him it in French, except I don't know the words for oven and bake and germs and things like that in French. And so what I told him was, yes, I want bread with dinner, but you have to set my bread on fire. I said, if it's not on fire, it can make me sick, and your bread can even kill me. And he looked at me like there's this crazy woman who's asking for flaming bread. What must America be like? So then we sit down to dinner, and I ended up saying no bread because we couldn't figure out how not to set bread on fire and have it still be edible for me. So anyway, I said no bread. He made this amazing dinner, and I sat down and looked at all this food, and what I meant to say was, wow, I'm hungry, which is j'ai faim. But what I actually said was j'ai une faim, which means I sat down, looked at all this food, and exclaimed, wow, I have a wife. Needless to say, 2 days later when my driver came, these people were super stoked that I was leaving. So my driver came, and he's this very kind Togolese man, and before we started out on our 9-hour drive, we sat down and we had breakfast together. And the driver asked if I would tell him a little bit about my story. So I told him I wrote this book called The Invisible Girls, and it weaves my story together with a story of a refugee family that I met when I was on the train in Portland, Oregon. What had happened was I was living on the East Coast, going to grad school in New York City, and I was diagnosed with breast cancer when I was 27 years old. My whole life fell apart. I ended up selling everything I had. I got on a plane to Portland with just a suitcase of clothes and landed there, convinced that my life was over and that I was going to be unloved, unlovable, and alone. And then I was riding the train one day, and this little girl fell asleep in my lap because she couldn't find an open seat. And then I started talking to her mom, who told me that they were refugees from Somalia, that she was here by herself with 5 little girls who were under the age of 9. I ended up getting their address, and I went to check on them, and I found that they were living in absolute poverty. They didn't know how to work the heat in their apartment. They had 1 blanket for the 6 of them, so they would just huddle under this blanket together to sleep at night. And then they'd run out of money, and they'd run out of food, so the mom had taken to dumpster diving. And when I showed up at their apartment, the little girls were eating moldy bread dipped in ketchup because that's all their mom could find in the trash. I started going back to their apartment. I developed a relationship with them. And as I taught them how to live in America and not only begin to just survive, but to thrive in their new life here, they were helping me because they loved on me, and they showed me that I was loved. I was not unlovable, and they opened up my broken heart again. I wrote a book about them, and all the proceeds from this book go into a college fund for the 5 little Somali girls so that they have a chance to go to college. We've got some books out here in case you want to pick up a copy later. So I was telling the driver, this is my story. And he's very gentle, very wise, Togolese man, and he's nodding, and he said, yeah. He said, love looks around. I said, it does, doesn't it? Love looks around, and it sees people with the eyes of God. Love looks around and sees marginalized and invisible people who often get overlooked. Yes, love looks around. He took a sip of his coffee, and he was sitting there still nodding his head. And then he said, speaking of looking around, and then he told me that there's only one road that goes from Lomé to Mongo. That parts of it are paved, but a lot of it is unpaved road, and a lot of it goes through very desolate places, and there are armed robbers who often jump out and carjack cars going through that area. He said sometimes they just take the car and the valuables in it. Other times they actually shoot the people in the car. So he said, speaking of looking around, while we're driving, I'd like you to look around and tell me if you see men with guns. So I climbed into the back seat of the Land Rover, and I had my face glued against the window. I didn't know it was possible to go 9 hours without blinking, but I'm pretty sure I did it. Thankfully, we didn't run into any bad guys, and we ended up arriving at the hospital. There is a 4-bed ER, and then there are 40 beds for men, women, there's a maternity ward, and pediatrics. The shifts are 28 hours long. I would go to work at 7 o'clock in the morning, work all through the day, on call all through the night. I slept at the hospital, wake up the next morning and work again until 11 o'clock in the morning or noon. People were dying at alarming rates. I saw more people die in 1 week at this hospital than I had in 10 years of practicing medicine in the States. They were dying of things like tuberculosis, meningitis, rabies. We had a little girl whose mom pierced her ears and she died of tetanus because they don't have pediatric immunizations there. We had a little girl who fell out of the tree and her diaphragm was paralyzed, and so she died because she couldn't breathe, and we couldn't afford ventilators at the hospital. So if people couldn't breathe on their own, they would die. I ended up getting malaria. I got very sick, passed out, got taken to the hospital, and I was a patient there for 3 days, and then I was in bed for a week after that, just super sick. And then I started getting better, and I started working again at the hospital. And especially after having been sick, I was emotionally and physically wiped out. It's the hardest thing I've ever done in all my life was to work at that hospital. There were some patients who just affected me personally more than others. And there was this little girl who I totally fell in love with. She was a 2-year-old little girl, and her dad carried her in, and she had what's called cerebral malaria. So malaria is a parasite that's transmitted by a mosquito bite, and especially in children, the parasite can infect their brain, and they start having seizures. If it gets really bad, they can actually go into a coma and die. So this little girl came in with cerebral malaria. She had a super high fever, and she was seizing, and so we admitted her to pediatrics, and we started giving her medicine and her IV to make the seizures stop. Her father was the most devoted parent I've ever seen. Her father slept on the floor underneath her crib. When she would have a seizure, the father would climb out from under the crib. He would stand behind me and watch over my shoulder as we gave her medicine, and he would stand there watching until the seizure stopped, and then he would crawl back under and he would go back to sleep. I prayed so hard for this little girl. I don't think I've ever prayed for a literal miracle in my life, But I thought, God, if you say that if I have faith as small as a mustard seed, I can move a mountain, I am going to pray in faith that you will save this little girl, because I couldn't handle how much her death would grieve her father. So I prayed for days. I prayed for God to save this little girl's life. I went back to the hospital for my next shift, and she wasn't any better. And during the course of the day, she started getting worse and worse and worse until the seizures were just almost constant. We didn't have a ventilator to put her on to breathe, and every time she had a seizure, she would stop breathing. And so I stood there all night long, breathing for this little girl, just bagging her. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I looked at her pupils, and they were abnormal, and I realized that this little girl had irreversible brain damage from the lack of oxygen and from the seizures. But I couldn't stop trying to save her because I couldn't handle how badly her death would hurt her father, and so I kept going. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. I am 19 hours into a shift, and I stood there for hours all through the night breathing for this little girl. And finally, at 6 o'clock in the morning, I checked her pupils again, and they were blown, which meant the little girl was brain dead, and she was gone. Her father had been standing there behind me all night watching us try to save his little girl. And I just turned and looked at him, and I shook my head. And her father ran out of the hospital. I went after him to see where he had gone, and I came around the corner. The sun was just starting to come up, and I found this man kneeling in the dirt, facing the sunrise, because he's Muslim and he was bowing towards Mecca. He was kneeling in the dirt, and he just had tears streaming down his face. I left him as he was. I just walked back inside. I took out the little girl's IV. I pulled off all the patches and all the wires, and then I wrapped her in a piece of cloth. And when her father came in, I handed him the body of his little girl that I couldn't save. And I said, "Je suis désolée. I am so sorry." And he looked at me and he said, "Thank you." He said, "There was love in your eyes. You looked at my little girl with love." And then he took her body and he took it home to bury her. When my shift ended, I went back to my room, and there was a huge rainstorm. And so I ended up laying there listening to a podcast that I downloaded about the story of Sisyphus. Sisyphus is a Greek myth, and in the myth, the gods get angry at him and they condemn him to an eternal punishment. His punishment is that he's going to have a really heavy rock on his back. He's going to have to carry it up a hill, and just before he gets to the top of the hill, the rock's going to roll back down and he's going to have to start over again. So for all of eternity, he has to carry this heavy rock, almost get to the top, and then start over again. It leads to an adjective. There's actually an adjective that's called Sisyphean. So if you guys see that on your GRE, for those of you who are going to grad school, you have me to thank. You know what it means, Sisyphean, right? It means something that's futile, hopeless, endless, Sisyphean. For those of you who are into landscape architecture, they actually make a Sisyphus garden gnome. It's this little guy with a huge rock on his back that he can't move. So if you want a symbol of eternal futility and frustration there in your lawn looking at you every morning, you guys can get a gnome, okay? This is really why I came to talk to you about GRE adjectives and garden gnomes. All right, so those are the tips I have for you. So Sisyphean. I love that adjective. And I said to God, Sisyphean, that's what this hospital is. It is never ending. You can spend all your energy, all your time, and then as soon as it's time for my next shift, I go back and I do it all over again. It seems like it's just endless. I got really into the story. I got super interested in it, and so I started doing some more reading about it. And I found that the famous writers Kafka and Camus had both been captivated by the story and had written essays about it. And they both concluded that we must consider Sisyphus to be the victor of the story, not the victim, that we must think of him as a hero, that we must even consider Sisyphus to have been happy. But they didn't say exactly why we should think of him as happy. So I kept reading until I came across a poem by the poet Stephen Mitchell. And he said, we must consider Sisyphus to be happy for one reason, and it's this. Because Sisyphus fell in love with the rock. Sisyphus fell in love with the rock. And so it was nothing for him to put it on his back and take it up that hill. It reminded me of 1 Corinthians 13. It's a chapter about love. It's about why we do what we do. In the beginning, it says, if you serve other people, if you learn another language, if you give your money away, if you give your life away, what should motivate you to make sacrifices like that? And the last verse in the chapter is right here. It says, now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. I think in Western Christianity, we've gotten the order really mixed up, and we have really attached ourselves to the word faith. We misuse it a lot, so instead of believing that God does the supernatural and the invisible, we use it to mean we mentally assent to a list of doctrines or dogma on the page, and we call ourselves people of faith. We refer to Christians as a community of faith, and we define ourselves by being people of faith. Why don't we call ourselves people of love? Why don't we say we're a community of love? How did we get that order backwards? When I think about Jesus, it reminds me of Sisyphus in the story, who has fallen in love with the rock, and so he carries it up the hill. Love is what Jesus had, right? Jesus fell in love with the world on his back. He carried it all the way up the hill of Calvary, and he died for it. We are called to be people of love, and this is my invitation to you all this morning. To not settle to be people who define yourselves by your faith, by the list of beliefs on a page, by a list of behaviors that you will and will not do. Don't settle to be a person of hope who just thinks, well, in heaven everything's okay, so that means that for now, I don't have to do anything because God makes it all better later. Be a person of love. Be a person who falls in love with the world and does something about it. I have the honor of working with Compassion International, which is an organization that's doing this. And here's what we're doing and what I'm going to invite you to be a part of. First of all, there's a big problem right now that's called extreme global poverty. There are more than 1 billion people in the world who are living on less than $1.25 a day. They don't have reliable access to water, to food, to medicine, or to shelter. And these people are dying of preventable causes, and they're dying at alarming rates. And I can tell you this, I've seen this with my own eyes. I've watched these people die in front of me from things that are totally preventable. But I didn't come here today just to land a heavy statistic on you and make you guys feel super guilty or super depressed, I promise. I came because there's actually really, really good news. Since 1990, the rate of extreme global poverty has dropped by more than 50%, and we are on track to end it by 2030. Which means this: your generation, you all here in this room, are going to be the ones to end extreme global poverty. You guys get to do that. You all get to say to your children, you get to say, when I was in college, there were 1.2 billion people in the world living on less than $1.25 a day, dying of crazy things at alarming rates, and that doesn't happen anymore because we ended it. You all get to do that, but it will not happen if you settle. It will not happen if you settle to be just a person of faith who is content to believe the right doctrines listed on a page. It will not happen if you only pay attention to what happens in eternity, to what happens in heaven, and you don't pay attention to what's happening around you right now. It will only happen if you choose to be people of love who fall in love with the world on your back and carry it up. So compassion, right? Compassion is doing that. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the mission statement is releasing children from poverty in Jesus' name. They get sponsors. So for $38, you sponsor a child. They go into the poorest neighborhoods of the poorest countries. They build these centers where children can come and they can have clean water. They can have nutritious food. They get help with their schoolwork, and they get adults who mentor them and who help them mature emotionally and spiritually. I had the chance to visit a site in Ecuador with them, and then I had a chance to visit their site in Togo the day before I flew out of Togo. I got to meet my little guy that I sponsor there. His name is Felix, and he's 14. The picture on the right is Felix's house. He lives with his mom, dad, brother, and sister in a corner of a dirt lot in a house that's just plywood and like corrugated aluminum that's kind of stuck together. They don't have a toilet. They don't have running water. They have to go to a well a couple blocks away, and the water there is contaminated, but they drink it anyway because that's all they have. And then they don't have electricity. So Felix was actually falling behind in his schoolwork because when he got home, it was too dark to see his schoolwork because they don't have a light in their house. Now that Felix has a sponsor, he's able to go to the center. He's able to eat nutritious food. He's actually excelling in school because he has a place to do his schoolwork. And he has people who love him and who invest in him. So here's the thing. I've invited you all to be people of love, to be people of action, so that no matter what God calls you to do and where God leads you, you will be somebody who's invested in the world, who takes action. And today I have a specific challenge for you. I brought with me packets of children from around the world who are all waiting for a sponsor. By the end of chapel, I challenge you to make all those packets gone. I challenge you at the end of chapel, we will have a sponsor for each one of those kids who's waiting for somebody to say, I love you, I believe in you, let's get you out of here. It may cost you something, right? So it may cost you some time. You may be a little bit late to lunch or to your class. For those of you who don't have $38 a month to give, you may have to get creative. Get 4 people together and say we're each going to give $10 and we're going to sponsor a kid together. You may have to make a personal sacrifice. Maybe instead of paying the $15 for the movie ticket, you can stay home and play a board game or, heaven forbid, read a book. That may be the biggest sacrifice of all, right? Sit down and look at a book for a while. You may have to make sacrifices together and say, hey guys, let's eat at the cafeteria on Friday night instead of going to In-N-Out, so that we can give some kid in Bangladesh the chance to get an education, to impact his family, his community, and his country, and lift them out of poverty. That's like the best reason ever to eat leftovers. So it may cost you something, but it's an opportunity to be a person of love, to be a person who imitates Jesus, to pick up the world and carry it higher. I'm going to pray for you. Then we're going to dismiss you. There are some great opportunities out here in the Global Outreach Fair that you can come and check out. The compassion table's right there, so pick up a packet, sponsor a child. The books are there if you want to buy a book to support the Somali girls. There's lots of opportunities, but I challenge you to think about Sisyphus. Think about Jesus. Be a person who falls in love with the rock and carries it up. Jesus, we thank you. We thank you that you fell in love with us. We thank you that you didn't wait, that you came in, that you carried us up, that you died for us on Calvary, and that because of the resurrection, we have the opportunity to come to new life in you, to be people who are also people of love. I pray for each of these students that you would captivate them with the love that you have for them, and then that love would motivate them to be a person who takes action, to be a person who falls in love with the rock and carries it high up the hill. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.